Hello, and welcome to the Finger Lakes One television studio, where we will be talking about the power of friends at work today. I'm here with Zach Cornett and my special guest, Rich Gallagher. We're going to be talking about issues such as communication, trust, boundaries, loyalty, all the things that you deal with in the workplace, but don't necessarily talk about. So I think we're going to have a wonderful day. I'm particularly delighted to have Rich here because he is the millionaire writer. I met Rich about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, where there were some issues going on in my place of business, a local community college, where we wanted to deal with conflict, dealing with difficult people, and customer service. And at that time, Rich had a published book called What Do You Say to a Porcupine?, which kind of inspired us. Our first meeting was in a local restaurant, and I was so taken by his warmth and energy that we knew that the training that we were going to offer to all of our employees was going to be top-notch, and it was. But, you know, Rich is one of those people that also embodies what Gary Vaynerchuk calls jab, 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 right hook. Give, give, give before you ever do anything. And he is a giver. He's recently helped me with the Power of Friends at Work book that I'm writing. He's one that always wants to reach out and do for others. And by default, wonderful things happen back to him. So he's my delightful guest today. And I'm going to turn things over to Rich. I want to ask you first, Rich, how did you happen to get here today? What was your childhood like, your early days in school? What was your life like that brought you to the place that you are today?
Oh, I'd be happy to walk you through that, Deb. And first of all, I'm delighted to be here. As Deb mentioned, I did read an advanced draft of your book. That is such an important message, and you've always, all the years I've known you, been such a great spokesperson for that concept. So I'm honored to be one of the first guests on your television show about it. Yes. So in terms of my history, I'm kind of a mutt. I'm a psychotherapist. For many years, I've been a writer and public speaker on communication skills and a ghostwriter. I have about 12 books written. 4 of which were for the Amacom division of HarperCollins, and 2 of those were national bestsellers. And before that, I spent close to 20 years in the software industry. And that was actually how I got to do what I do, because now, back when I went to college, when dinosaurs roamed the earth in the 1970s, I was one of Cornell University's first dual majors in engineering and psychology. People joked that I would eventually grow up to build bridges that would talk people out of jumping off of them. And I was really torn between, do I want to be an engineer or a therapist? And so I did both at different stages of my life. But really, that had a big influence on my becoming a leader. In terms of my childhood, I came from a big family of 5 children. I had 2 amazing parents. I had a father who was extremely successful at what he did. He was an engineer. He got a PhD at midlife and became a professor at Cornell, and then went on to become a dean, a provost, and eventually president of our hockey rival Clarkson University. But my mother was funny, brash, had a bit of an ego, had a heart of gold, and I really learned much more from my mother about my career than my father, because her people skills were just incredible. And she was in her element as First Lady of Clarkson, for example. So what I learned about relationships, I really learned from my mother. And so there's always been the split between technology and the human craft, so to speak. So when I grew up, I wanted to be a Catholic priest, and then at age 18, I met a beautiful woman who I'm still married to, and so that changed that career goal. But really, being a therapist, being someone who teaches people how to communicate, is a secular version of what I wanted to do when I was a kid.
I love the way you love your wife. And I think, when you talk about your wife and then the feelings that you have for her, I bet your mother, in keeping the home fires burning and raising 5 children, gave some of that to you, because you really go above and beyond in the way that you talk about your bride. How many years have you been married?
We've been married for 40 years this year, and together for 45.
And you guys act like it's been 5.
You're right. Well, we are still madly in love with each other, so thank you for asking.
How did you meet?
We actually met on a summer job together when I was 18 years old.
The power of friends at work.
The power of friends at work, exactly.
What was the job?
It was, we were both in the stockroom of a department store back then. This was a summer job for me. And, I meet this beautiful woman, and I go out on a date with her. And after we've been dating for a little while, she starts talking about teachers at our high school that I had never heard of. And it turns out she's like 6.5 years older than me, which is a big deal when you're 18 years old.
Yeah, it is.
And so I go back through my old yearbook and I see this woman with a bob hairdo and butterfly in her glasses. Oh no, what have I gotten myself into? but no, one of the most amazing things in my life was meeting someone who was truly a soulmate when I was 18 years old and still being with her today.
Yeah, because you can tell that she's still your soulmate,
Absolutely.
which is beautiful. How do you keep that? How do you cultivate? I mean, this is about work relationships, but so many of our work relationships are like our personal relationships.
Absolutely.
How do you keep that so tight and fresh and loving?
That's a great question. I'm going to tie this back to personality types and also to how you communicate with each other. Because if you're familiar with what's known as Myers-Briggs personality types, for those of you in the audience who aren't familiar with that, I'm not going to go through the details or the letters or whatever that we use, but we're both a very minority personality type that you could characterize as touchy-feely people, people who very much care about people and relationships. When I've met other people who share that personality type, they really tend to bond with each other because they very much care about the relationship. So if you're not my personality type, though, I think the other thing is that we can talk to each other about anything. And so here I'm going to tie this in with my experience as a marriage and family therapist, working with couples in conflict. I administer a quantitative assessment to them. It's David Burns' Relationship Satisfaction Inventory, which is one of the most scientifically validated tools for relationships. And based on their scores, they usually fall into one of two buckets based on their scores. One bucket, and thankfully this is a majority of people, they really do love each other, and there is compassion for each other underneath it, but they don't know how to problem solve. They don't know how to communicate. We can fix those things, and the vast majority of those people come out of family therapy much happier than when they came in. Then there's a smaller percentage where they may actually communicate very well, but there's no spark between them. And in those cases, I could prescribe communication skills, I could prescribe long walks on the beach, I could prescribe standing on your head, but really, for a lot of those people, I'd say almost half of them, it's like trying to bring a dead fish back to life. So the other advice I'd say is follow your gut, because, one thing that I'll say when people always ask me as a family therapist about my own marriage is I'll say, I fell really hard for somebody when I was 18 years old, and I still feel the same way. So, look for that spark. One thing I refer to it as is the Wegmans test. Of course, Wegmans is a huge grocery store chain here, and they have big stores. Ours is the size of like 2 football fields. What's the first thing that you think that pops into your head when you see your partner coming around the other end of one of those long aisles here? When I see my wife, the first thing I think, even if we've been fighting, even if, is, there's my beautiful
that
wife.
Feeling, that kind of taking your breath away, heart races a little bit. I mean, it's so wonderful to have that at our age.
Exactly correct. So pass the Wegmans test. That's my other
the
advice.
Wegmans test, good. And that communication, I think you're right. It's a combination of both. It's a combination of the care and the excitement. You have to think that there's got to be a little fire there.
Absolutely.
And the communication. In terms of not only personal but in work, is it better to keep your mouth shut when you're a little bit frustrated, or is it better to always be out there, or is it somewhere in between when you have something to say?
Didn't mean to interrupt you. You're right in my wheelhouse here.
Okay.
I think it's important to share how you feel about something, but the way you do it is critically important. There was a therapist many years ago who proposed getting your anger out and used to give people foam bats to hit each other and so forth. Studies show that that's like the worst thing you can possibly do. So sharing your frustration, sharing your anger is not a good thing. I do not believe you should hold your feelings in, because I really believe that colors how you see the person, and then that informs everything you say to them. There are strength-based ways to get any idea across to anybody, and you do it by understanding how the other person thinks, painting their position as that of a totally reasonable person, and then being very strong in your own opinions and your own truth so that you build a dialogue. If I could make a short political analogy, is, of course, I live in Ithaca, and for someone like me who's politically moderate, there are a lot of people with very strong political opinions. And when someone comes up to me, as happens often, says, I have really extreme political views, if I know anything at all about what they're saying, the first thing I'm going to say is, I totally get where you're coming from. You probably believe in X, Y, and Z, right? And I make sure that their head's nodding up and down. That comes from my heart. If I do a good enough job at that, and I acknowledge and validate everything that they're telling me, it makes it much easier for me to press forward and say, and believe it or not, I actually feel really strongly in the opposite direction because of A, B, and C. I've had so many cordial conversations with people who violently disagree with me because I hear them first. One other really quick example is I was just back in one of my old hometowns of Pittsburgh watching the Pirates, and I was sitting at the stadium in front of a group of men who were very conservative. One of them was wearing a Trump shirt. And they were having such an intelligent, polite, and thoughtful discussion about a view of the world that's totally different from mine. And, if we hear each other, and the same's true in workplace conflict or anything else, if we make the other person a reasonable person and then engage them with our view of the world, amazing things happen.
Acknowledge them.
Exactly.
And you're such a great, it's interesting you'd say that, because one of my first recollections of meeting you is what a great listener you are.
Thank you. And
What a
listening
skill.
is a skill, not a belief. In other words, there's mechanics to listening to people well that boil down to really acknowledging and hearing what the other person is saying and playing that back to them. If there was a Nobel Prize for communication skills, it would be the person who realized that acknowledging somebody is not the same as agreeing with them.
Right. Well, I remember that the first time we met, you really took time to hear everything that we were talking about, and then you didn't shoot first and ask questions later. You asked the questions and seemed to be processing it along the way, but in a non-judgmental way.
It helped that you folks were such fascinating people. It was really easy with you guys. You guys were such great people to work with, and so I truly was enthralled with your story.
Thank you. So along the way, you've done a lot of work along the way in doing corporate training and corporate consulting. What are the types of things that you see as issues in organizations and companies, things that they're really facing that they need your help with?
I think they need to read your book, and I'm not just saying that to butter up to you because I'm your show, but your concept of building good relationships with people and the mechanics of building those good relationships is something you hit very well in your book, and something I've tried to hit as I talk about how people communicate in the workplace. Let me give you one quick example of that.
Yes.
Let's say that you and I go arm in arm and give a workshop on how to treat people well at work, and we say you should build good relationships with your peers at work. Everyone's going to smile and nod and say that's a great idea. If you look at what actually happens in a company, though, different departments of most successful businesses make work for each other and have different personalities and have conflicts, and human nature pulls us to theming them. That sales department is always overpromising things. That product development department never wants to help us make a sale. So you have to take proactive action to change that dynamic up front before you run into the conflicts. You have to build those relationships first. When I managed customer contact operations for large software companies, whenever we'd hire a new salesperson, I'd give them my card and say, you call me 24 hours a day. And sometimes they would. But they were there for me too, and those relationships really changed that. I'll give you one other quick example, if that's okay, of which is a little more personal. So I was director of customer services at a big software company in California. We often had training courses, and the lunch that we catered, if people would come from India and say that they were vegetarian, then they bring them like a salad or something. So I made it a point, if anyone came from India, I'd take them to a good Indian restaurant, and I get to know them. So one professor from India, he and I just hit it off famously. We had similar personalities. So he went on to become a professor at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, and he became good friends with one of the largest software companies there. And when they needed somebody to head their computer graphics team, which was my field back in the 90s, he recommended me, and I got hired by them. Not just because I was good in my field, because he wanted his dinner partner back.
Right.
And so anything successful I've done in my life has lived on the wings of great relationships with people, and you have to build those relationships proactively up front, long before you ever worry about what you're going to do for each other.
What are some of the things you need to do to build a relationship?
Delight in each other's company, first of all. In other words, if you see and appreciate their view of the world and the work that they do and empathize with that and hear it, you'll find that that reciprocates, first of all. And then the other big part of it is that you keep in contact and you share what's going on in your lives. I had a big advantage when I lived in Pittsburgh because the Pirates were the National League champions almost every year, and we lived at Three Rivers Stadium, and so that was our therapy. I fell in with a bad crowd of managers that didn't just watch the game, they managed the team. And in between yelling at the umpires, we shared so much about our lives and so much about our work as friends, and those relationships have stuck with me for the rest of my life.
Oh, that's wonderful. And it's interesting to see how connection helps you get connected. I mean, by connecting others, by keeping those relationships, gets you connected, that you got a fabulous job from it.
Absolutely.
And that's, I think, when it's done sincerely. You know, have you ever seen people that have been trying so hard to network that it's kind of a turnoff?
My goodness, you've hit the nail exactly on the head. And almost any good relationship that I've ever had started with a friendship where I could have cared less if I did any business with them. I just delighted in their company. And those relationships have carried me through the rest of my life.
Yeah, we grew up in an era where they had the whole thing with body language, like parrot somebody's body language, parrot somebody's breathing. And it's like, just be yourself.
You see, that's a problem I have on the home front, is that if I try to use the kind of communication skills I teach, my wife's going to say, that's on page 37.
Right. Being a therapist.
I know what you're doing.
Did you have any mentors along the way that kind of led you to do what you've been doing throughout your life?
Absolutely. There were really two mentors that really changed my life in a big way. One is people who convinced me to start writing. So the backstory in that is, so I was part of a startup software company in Los Angeles, and we started with 5 people. We grew to become a major NASDAQ company, and I became their director of customer services, and that's how I first got involved with that. So like any good startup company back in those days, I was putting in 80-hour weeks. And so at one point, my wife says, Rich, I never see you anymore. And I said, okay, honey, so what would you like me to do? And she said, take a writing course with me. And I said, but Colleen, I'm a C student in writing. Take a writing course with me. So I did. We wrote poetry and plays. And at the end of it, the instructor took me aside and said, Rich, you're good at this. You could actually get published someday. I'm like, me? Really? And so that started me on a path of, writing seriously, papering my wall with rejection slips, and eventually learning the mechanics of being a published author. I now have, a dozen books out. I've sold over $1 million worth of books. That all started with somebody seeing potential in me. So that was one mentor. The other mentor was a manager that I had in Pittsburgh. So you mentioned I was a manager of software development, computer graphics specifically, at this big company in Pittsburgh. Their CEO founded the company. It was a garage venture in the 1970s. It's now a $1 billion company, and I reported directly to him. He was an amazing manager because he combined having incredibly high standards with being a wonderful person to work for. He had this knack of never making anyone ever feel shamed or feel bad, no matter how badly we messed up. And he could be very blunt and say, that's terrible. So his name was John Swanson, and his success and watching how quickly his company grew and looking how he took care of his people and what great relationships he had with all his people, that stuck with me for the rest of my own management career. And really almost everything I write about, everything I practice in working with people, that all circles back to John Swanson.
I was just reading something about strengths-based leadership, and they say that if your manager ignores you, you're 40% less apt to be engaged. Right. If your manager focuses on your weaknesses, you're 22% less apt to be engaged. But if your manager focuses on your strengths, you're only maybe 1% less engaged. How did John Swanson manage you?
Well, he was great in the sense that he had high expectations, for me and everybody else who worked for him. And we were all very busy. He worked about as hard as any 3 people I've ever known. But conversely, he invested in our development, and that was his way of showing us that he believed in us. So if you wanted to present a paper in Germany or if you wanted to take a business trip, he would always approve it. And but the return he got back, his people would jump over a cliff for him. And so when I managed a customer contact operation back here in upstate New York, one of the first things I did, for example, was everybody had the same title. Everyone was a customer service representative. And so one of the first things I did was, within that first year, every other person in our group was a development liaison, a training coordinator, a subject matter expert. Everyone had a reason to feel important when they walked in the door every morning. That made such a huge difference in how we transformed our service ratings and our revenues.
So there were rewards for the good work. You could go to the conferences. You got acknowledged. So he rewarded good behavior.
He did, and he saw the better angels in everybody. So this is an even more important point for your employees that you struggle with, the ones who aren't doing so well. So I'm 63 years old now, and I've worked probably with about 2,000 people in my life. So if you look at this cloud over your head of all the people you've ever worked with, and then you narrow that down to those who were the problem, in my case about 50 people maybe.
Right.
And then if you think about how many of them really turned it around, in my case I'm looking at half a dozen. I wish it was 49, but it's maybe half a dozen. For too many people, when I bring this question up at workshops, it's nobody. Right. But if you look at what made those people turn it around, not one of them ever changed because they were written up for, disciplinary action or given a come to Jesus talk. Everyone in my life changed because somebody, sometimes me, sometimes other people, would take them aside and say, I see potential in you. And I know you're struggling with X, Y, and Z. We can work on that, but my goodness, we could do some awesome things together with these strengths that you have. That's become a big thing in the literature with the Gallup organization, Strengths Quest,
it's wonderful.
Marcus Buckingham's books like Now Discover Your Strengths and so forth. The radical idea that you don't try to change people's weaknesses, you turn them around towards their strengths. I'm not going to share a lot of war stories here because they're personal between player and coach, but I will say that I've watched that kind of approach be transformational with people that other people would have thought were lost causes.
Fantastic. That's so good to know. Fantastic. Focusing on the strengths, mitigate the weaknesses, find other people to deal with the weaknesses, because there's a lot of talent. Some people are idea people, other people are implementers. And
Absolutely.
So it's like, focus on what you're good at. Why waste all this time trying to change the way that you are? Go ahead.
Absolutely correct, Debbie. And, just to share one example here, the moment of truth for that kind of behavior, which I'm sure everybody watching is smiling and nodding at, is when something goes wrong. So I'll give you one quick example with an anonymous employee. So as you know, I managed call center operations for a lot of my career. And so one day I'm listening in on people's phone calls, which is an accepted business practice, and I hear one agent who's on the line with somebody who's talking incessantly. And at one point, he actually loses his patience, says, "Will you be quiet so I can talk to you, so I can talk with you?" And he actually used coarser language than that, but he was pretty frustrated. So what do you say to that person as a boss? Most people would say, "You shouldn't have said that," or "How would you feel if somebody else did that?" I went to this person's cubicle with a big smile on my face and said, "Hey, I was listening to your call. I would have been that frustrated too, and let's workshop how I'd handle these situations in the future." So I actually asked him to role play what that woman said to him, and I shut him down and taught him how to shut down with a big smile on my face. And I'm sure he slept well that night, knowing that I still liked him, I still respected him, and I thought no less of him for being human for a moment and then having a chance to learn with me. So that's a purposeful strategy that you have to choose if they're going to live the life that you lay out in your book.
That you actually did the role play and taught them how to do it the right way without a lot of criticism. It's so interesting because I have a similar story where I was when early in my career at the college, I was really, really rude to a customer. And so what my supervisor, the customer called my vice president. So my vice president called me in, and his strategy was to make the bad Debbie a whole other person than myself.
Awesome.
So yeah, it was really a unique strategy. He brought me in and he said, I got a call, and he said, "This is so unlike you." So he kind of separated that bad person that would ever talk to a customer this way from me, who I am as a person. "This is so unlike you. how did this happen? And then he said, I trust that it will. He could have fired me over this one, but he said, I trust this will never happen again. That the bad Debbie will never surface again. But I love the fact that he had a strategy to kind of pull it away.
I think that was brilliant.
I thought it was pretty brilliant.
And here's something that I'd add on top of that is sort of icing on the cake, because I do this frequently as both a leader and a therapist, is I normalize everything like crazy. It's a great interrogation technique, normalizing. It's a mathematical term. It doesn't mean something's okay or that you approve of it. It means that it's a norm for that other person. If I was as frustrated, I could see reacting that way too, or I've seen lots of other people react that way. One of my most common lines managing call center operations, because something goes wrong every day and something goes horribly wrong once a week, with a big call center operation, is I would say things like, what you said is what 99% of people would say in that situation. And so, that's our human nature. And let's look at some ways together that we can get past that human nature together. Because I know you're really good.
Yeah. Oh, so you're doing the same thing,
Exactly.
the affirmation of the good person.
Exactly correct.
Have you ever found, when you run a call center and there's so many employees, have you ever found that envy on the job can get in the way of people working together well on a team, and how would you address something like that? When people really think, hey, I'm smarter than she is, I'm a harder worker,
Absolutely.
I deserve to make as much money. How do you deal with a case like that, and have you had any scenarios?
Oh, very much so. Yeah, that's always an issue in workplaces. And I'll give you an example of that as a therapist, because I used to do a lot of workplace interventions where I'd go into a workplace that had conflicts, and one team would have a story that we work harder than those people over there,
Right.
and then those people would have a story, those other people exclude us, or, they create a toxic work environment for us. We have no motivation here. We're all burning out. And so if I go up to those second people and say, hey, how about you work harder? That's not going to work. So the strategy is always to get them to hear each other's stories. What I do in these workplace interventions is I do scenario-based exercises that are funny, not too personal, but use the same stories that both of those people have that I've had the privilege of hearing, and get people to engage them. And then I get them talking about, now what would you do with each other in a situation like that?
Managers hear that. That's a great strategy. Put together some scenarios, have them work it out, but the scenarios are actually about them in some kind of way. That's a great strategy to get them thinking about it.
Absolutely. Compare that to human nature, which would say, go to these people and say, stop being envious, work harder. Right. That always fails.
Right.
You have to hear each other's stories first before you can do the intervention.
Exactly.
And you have to like and respect everybody.
Yeah. So what are some of the other kind of issues that you've faced in working with all these companies for so many years? By the way, you look a lot younger, and you're too young to retire.
Flattery will get you everywhere, Debbie. So, no, these are great questions. I think the biggest problem that people have in the workplace is when good people try to do their jobs and something goes wrong, like your situation when you were rude with a customer. You didn't get up in the morning and say, boy, I'm going to be rude to people. You had a moment of humanity where your human nature pulled you to where you went. And I'm so glad that your boss had a strategy for that, and I would have totally understood that and seen your better angels. So almost anything that you see in terms of, like you mentioned, envy, for example, or people who see each other differently in each other, or complain about how hard the other person's working, or even have a personality conflict. Some people are introverts who don't like to be bothered. Some people are backslappy types who want to know how was your weekend, and that crosses boundaries for people. In all of these cases, my goal as a manager, my goal as a therapist is to get people to hear each other's stories and make them both feel good about who they are and work with it and engage it.
When you said that about some people have different, you can slap them on the back and different levels of boundaries. As a therapist, I'm sure you've come to the realization of so much of this, in addition to us seeing it on the news all the time. What about, the latest Me Too movement? What about the boundaries in the workplace in terms of how far, I'm a hugger, I'm Italian, we hug, we're very physical. How far do you go, how far can you go, and how do you figure all this out?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, first of all, you have to follow the norms of society. So, there are gender differences. So, you're a hugger. As a therapist, I wouldn't dream as a male therapist whose client may be a sexual abuse survivor, I am never going to touch a client unless they initiate the contact, like shake my hand. When I retired from private practice last year, almost all my female clients asked, is it okay for me to hug you? And I said, sure, because you asked. Go ahead and give me a hug.
When in doubt, ask.
When in doubt,
always.
ask, exactly. So I think, but the other part of the Me Too movement, and again, because I'm an engineer by training, I wish I could draw like a graph for you. I often use sort of a bell curve that has, more people in the middle and fewer people at the ends. When I talk about strength-based communication, I certainly would never say that you need to use strength-based communication if somebody is stealing the toilet paper or sexually harassing an employee. Then I have a 3-word technique for that called call the police or talk to HR. So there are times when you have to just speak truth to power, and there's times where boundaries matter and have to be enforced, and your communication skills aren't quite as important as what's right. But those are exceptions. And so I'd say the other part of it is know how you normally communicate with people, but also know where those hard boundaries are that can't be crossed. And I'm so glad to see that the Me Too movement is reinforcing those hard boundaries where imbalance of power or, work relationships have been misused.
I had some ambivalence about it until I heard Tarana Burton. She came and spoke at my college, and I went to hear her speak, and it totally changed my perspective on it. And truthfully, we always think about women, how women have been vulnerable in that situation, but men have as well. And it's caused me to think of the times that I crossed boundaries, that I didn't respect someone, or I gave mixed messages. So we all need to be aware the kind of messages we give and how we let people know what the boundaries are in a caring and compassionate way, of course.
And that's a great story because when we hear other people's stories, then that enlightens us. And so really, I think the ultimate goal of your relationships at work is to hear those stories and to have the kind of relationships where you share those stories with each other.
And to be educated on it. I think it's really important in the workplace to educate all employees on the topic.
Because there's a lot of stories out there in public now. And when you use that as a base to educate people as to what the norms of society, what the new norms are and always should have been, then that changes everything.
Right. I mean, one of my favorite TV shows is Mad Men. Have you ever
seen
it?
Absolutely.
Because that's our era.
Right.
That's our era.
Right.
And yet I think about it and I think, oh my God, people were drinking in the office and smoking and all kinds of things were going on.
Absolutely.
And boy, how things have changed. But I think,
thank goodness.
I think thank goodness, we're more productive, we're more respectful of each other.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a better world today in many, many respects. When I think about you, I really didn't know that you had material wealth. I always thought of you as having interpersonal wealth and personal wealth. But then when I started hearing about the Millionaire Writer and reading the Millionaire Writer, oh my goodness, you carry yourself with such humility and deference, and I honor you for that.
Well, thank you.
But boy, you've made a good living.
I have made a very good living.
So could you share a little bit about that aspect of your life?
Absolutely.
Especially for our entrepreneurs out there and our listeners that want that for themselves.
So I have a new book that just came out recently called The $1 Million Writer. And the reason, and I'll differentiate that from the Millionaire Writer because I'm not teaching people how to be a millionaire tomorrow. But I have had a very good living as a writer. And the thing is that people can very profitably write if they use the right strategies. And that actually, the title of that book, which is the cheesiest title in the world, and I'm embarrassed to even share it with you and your audience, but that came from a consultation I had last year as I was transitioning to retirement from a marketing consultant. The first question she asked me was, tell me about your career. And I said, well, I've sold over $1 million worth of books. I've done over $1 million worth of freelance writing and ghostwriting for other people. She said, you're the $1 million writer. Teach people how to do that. And the book is full of very practical advice for how to turn into a career. And it's very contrarian. So, for example, most people, when they think of being a writer, they think of writing books and articles. And those are very labor-intensive, low-profit activities. right now, as we speak, there are 3 people sitting at identical word processors writing identical amounts of verbiage, and one of them is writing a query for a national magazine, and it will never get accepted because they have a sky-high slush pile. Another person is writing a lifestyle piece for a blog, and she's going to get an honorarium that might pay for her next trip to Starbucks. The third person is writing a marketing blog for a corporation, and she's earning $70 an hour, and she's going to be writing them all year. And so I'll never forget when I ran screaming from corporate life in the 1990s, moved back to upstate New York with my homesick wife, and started making a living as a writer, which I actually supported my household for many years doing writing. And people would come up to me and say, "Oh, poor Rich, you can't get back into corporate life. You're older now. You have to settle for being a starving writer." And I'd smile and nod, "I'm making a 6-figure income."
Right.
So there's practical strategies for this. So, for example, one of the key points of the book is boring is better. Boring writing markets are lucrative, easy to get into, pay well, and there's ways you can break into those markets. So, for example, if you go to a software company with a copy of The Powered Friends at Work and say, "I could write your software manuals," you might get the gig. But if you create a curated example of how you would tell a great story in the genre and format of a software manual, you're hired. And so creating custom portfolios, getting into the head of those boring clients, that's a very lucrative gold mine of work. And the other half of the book is devoted to how to be a royalty published author, because being royalty published is the key to having a successful speaking career. It's not that profitable in and of itself, but it's the key to supercharging your freelancing career, your speaking career, and other streams of income. So I think is very important. So I also talk about how you break the code of royalty publishing and ghostwriting. And the one last example I'll give is if most people go out and ghostwrite somebody's book, then they're just going to listen to the other people's story and start writing. I have a very structured process, and I've written books for CEOs of major corporations. I told you which ones they'd have to shoot me. That they're very lucrative projects. But what I do in those is that, first of all, I get together with the executives and I give what I call the math lecture. I break down the mechanics of every type of best-selling business book that's out there. I'll say, Seth Godin uses lots of micro-examples and writes in second person. Thought leadership books have, 400, word examples. And then I say, these are all bestsellers. What do you want your book to smell like? And what does the leader want to sound like? Then I write a 10-page white paper that deconstructs how the leader sounds. Joe likes to use simple declarative sentences and isn't afraid of controversy. And then we do the outline of the book, and those 3 things become the game plan for me to sound like them.
So the content fits into the structure.
Exactly correct.
It's so interesting.
I write with a calculator.
Right. There's a structure to it. And because I was trying to think, as you talked about writing for a corporation, how would you know what to do as your preliminary? Would you benchmark similar corporations that are at a higher level? You'd go to their websites to get the sense of...
Absolutely. And I'll use an analogy that would show my age here. Okay, so one of my favorite bands is Tower of Power from the 1970s. They're still performing today. They have a great horn section, and that horn section rents itself out on other people's albums. And so they did a great article once on what they do when they come cold into the studio to play on somebody's song. It's like a math lecture. They basically look at the chart of the song they've never seen before. Okay, they say, let's put a bop here and do a ride out here and do a key change here. So they've scoped out the mechanics of what they're going to do long before they pick up their horns and start playing. That's exactly how I do any writing project for a client.
Well, that's great.
Because I know exactly where I'm going to put the bop and the ride out.
Fascinating. Great. Remember that, people. This is great. And so many companies and organizations are looking for content now. How can people find those organizations that are looking for content?
It depends on who you are and where you are. So, for example, if you live in Silicon Valley, it's crawling with technology companies. So you might want to look at if this is something you want to do. Writing manuals, documentation. If you live in Los Angeles, the entertainment industry has an endless need for PR, publicity, collateral materials, and so forth. New York has the advertising industry. But what you want to do is find those boring industries that you can, and then customize portfolios around what would excite them and get your name out there.
Get your name out there. Very good. Well, this is fascinating. I know that you have a lot of passion in your life because you express yourself that way. What are you passionate about today?
Funny you should mention that because, I recently transitioned to retirement, and I find that, being on a permanent vacation doesn't do it for me. So what I'm doing is I'm writing and teaching about things I really enjoy. So the $1 Million Writing Project, that was, the cheesiest thing in the world, but it's, information I wanted to get out there. I'm still, although I'm not an active therapist right now, I closed my private practice so that I could travel with my wife, and I'm still active in the field in terms of doing continuing education for other therapists. I had a fairly successful book published last year called No Bravery Required on losing fears and phobias, which was my clinical specialty as a therapist. And I actually just had my first ever refereed research paper accepted on treating OCD at an OCD conference. I'll be presenting that next month in Washington, D.C. So the answer to your question, Debbie, is I'm still a mutt, and I'm still having fun.
And you love variety,
and
obviously.
I love writing, absolutely.
And you use all your skills. Now, a lot of the people that we work with have lost passion.
Yes.
They're not happy. They hate their jobs. They just want to do something. They don't care what it is. I have to do something different. If a person doesn't have a lot of alternatives, they've got to put food on the table.
Absolutely.
How can they get their passion back for their job? And is that even possible? It's kind of like the marriage. If there's not the spark, can they get it?
Absolutely. Okay. Well, for much of my life, I was the worst example in the world of that. When I was 28 years old, I looked in the mirror and said, I'm 28 years old. What do I really want to do? And what the mirror said back is, I'd like to be like, one of these writer, speaker, psychotherapist types. And I said back to myself, come on, I've got a wife, a mortgage, I'm at the leadership level of my software profession, forget it. Mm-hmm. And over time, my lack of passion for what I was doing really caught up with me. Mm-hmm. I got to a point where now I'm almost 40 years old, my company's laying people off left and right. And so I did something very brave. I raised my hand and said, oh, pick me, me. And I left with a consulting rotator and came back upstate and started writing. Mm-hmm. What's interesting is the second half of my life where I did all the things I wanted to do when I was in my 20s, not only were much more fun for me, but they were much more lucrative. So the first thing is, know yourself and read your gut and follow your gut. Mm-hmm. I don't care if you collect garbage for a living, and I've actually have a great war story I'll share some other time about very successful, people in the waste management industry. Mm-hmm. Whatever you have a passion for, find ways to make that part of your life, because if you're really good at something and you're really into it, you're going to be much more successful.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of an interesting thing. Did you actually give up the day job and go 100% into the consulting at that point?
In my case, yes.
Okay, which is fantastic.
Not everybody has that option.
And if you have the support for that, it's super. But then if you don't have the support for that, you can keep your day job and start building a little bit at a time.
Absolutely, you can.
Toward making that transition by doing what you love.
We all have 168 hours in the week, and most of us spend maybe 40 or 50 on our day jobs. And we've got all that time otherwise that you can invest in things that you really want to do. And the other thing is that, and I'm a huge fan of self-employment. I've been self-employed for the last quarter century. I actually think it's the most stable way to make a living in the world. But if you're a consultant, you can do anything. You can, if you write, you're a consultant. If you speak, you're a consultant. If you mow lawns, you're a consultant. So you can do lots of ands. You don't have to be just one thing. You can do whatever the market needs and keep the wolf from the door.
And what if you don't know where to go?
Then this is a good opportunity for connecting with other people. And I would circle us back to knowing yourself, because some people, the bucket that they fall in is work, and they're able to compartmentalize that as work. I'm of a personality type where what I do for a living needs to be meaningful to me. Mm-hmm. But then there's other people who are more than happy to just punch in, punch out for their 8 hours a day, go back home to their wife and 2.5 kids in the suburbs, and that's a good life for them. So I'm not going to say that they need to be like me or you.
Right. Everybody is different. They have their own niche. They have their own personalities. When you think about what you would like your family and your I hate to use the word legacy, but what would you like to be remembered for in the world of work, in the world in general? What would you like to be remembered?
I'm going to circle that back to my days wanting to be a Catholic priest. I always wanted to help people, and anything I do, whether it's writing, psychotherapy, or all these other crazy things that I do, they all have a common denominator of wanting to help people. I've never been motivated by making money. I've never been motivated by being known or successful. But the fact that what I do helps somebody is what gives me a charge personally.
Yeah, and you've helped so many through your books. What's the favorite book that you've written?
My favorite book is also my best-selling book, which is How to Tell Anyone Anything, because it's really a game plan for how to execute these workplace relationships that give everybody trouble. One of the greatest joys of my life as a speaker and a writer was striking gold when I focused on how to handle your worst situations with people. Or I'd get up on stage, point at my glasses, and say, "Here, get angry at me, and let me show you how to workshop that." So, How to Tell Anyone Anything, far and away my favorite book.
So, if it's How to Tell Anyone, what if it's your boss?
Oh, definitely.
And what if there comes punishment with telling that person?
If you follow my advice, there shouldn't be punishment.
Okay,
that's the whole thing. I start the book
how does
with
it
that.
work?
What you do is you have to acknowledge and validate everything that the boss says. So first, you start in a safe place, and if you've got a toxic boss who puts too many demands on you or is always criticizing you, I might start off by asking the boss to clarify their expectations. Acknowledge and validate that like crazy, first of all. Paint their position as that of a totally reasonable person. And then if you do a good enough job of those first 3 steps, which feel like drinking poison for most people, and you live or die on your ability to acknowledge the other person's position, then you have the opportunity to speak to their benefit and get your ideas as firmly as you want on the table. Say, "Boss, I want to give you everything that you want, because that makes perfect sense to me. I find I don't work as well when I'm being criticized a lot. Where could we go with that?" And you're not going to get fired for having that conversation, usually. And
that open-ended, I like that. Where could we go with it instead of coming to a conclusion?
Because the problem only gets solved when the answer comes out of their mouth, not your mouth.
Oh, that's great advice. So you're opening the door and you're doing it in a way that will give them the opportunity to talk.
Absolutely.
Are there ever times where sometimes you just got to cut the cord?
That's true. And knowing when to say, "Gentlemen, I quit, this isn't a good situation," is, I think, a very important tool to have in your toolkit as well, rather than laboring along like a dull toothache at something that's never going to work for you.
So what now? What next in your life?
So,
what are the plans from here on in?
I've gone from one of the cheesiest books I've ever written to an even cheesier project that I'm working now. I did an article kind of on a lark in LinkedIn recently called "A Simple Hack for Being Happier, Much Happier." And most of my articles get shared like by 4 people. This got shared by like 1,000 people. It's gone viral.
It was great.
And so I've been talking to some of my colleagues in the therapy profession. I'm actually thinking of doing a book called A Therapist's Guide to Happiness. Because if you cracked open my head, you'd find a pretty happy guy inside most of the time. And there's mechanics behind that. This is where the engineering side of me comes in. And I'll read lifestyle articles where they'll say to be happy, change your attitude, have gratitude. I'm like, no, cognitive behavioral therapy. And so I want to look at the mechanics of how we therapists truly make people and ourselves happier.
Yeah. It's interesting, and I don't want to call the Dalai Lama cheesy, but he wrote a book called The Art of Happiness.
It was a great book. I read it.
It's one of my favorite books.
It is one of my It's not cheesy at all. He's very pragmatic in his strategy.
He is. And one of the things he says is that everyone has a certain set point for happiness.
I agree.
I happen to come from a family, now I don't know if it's because we're Italian. I don't know if it has something to do with manicotti and ravioli and biscotti. I'm not positive, but we have a certain set point for happiness.
Yes.
Everybody in my family get us together. We're talking like crazy. We're laughing. It becomes a free-for-all.
Absolutely.
I don't know if it's genetic or if it was, I don't ever remember it being cultivated. What are some of the tips that you're going to give for happiness?
Well, people talk about changing their attitude. There's mechanics behind how you can change the language you use with yourself so that what you're worried about or frustrated about or angry about is more practical, less scared, but still very real and very honored by you, and then you can work with it. The article I wrote talked about when something bad happens in your life, you have a choice between helplessness and agency, where you're saying, okay, this stinks, and here's what I'm going to do, even if your choices are lousy choices. So that's one good example. Approaching things that you fear in very small steps is another example. Building connections with people that, again, have mechanics. As a family therapist, I have so much fun with couples in conflict, getting them to talk to each other in different ways and change the dynamic between them so that they have a different reality between them. these are all mechanics. They're all strategies. None of them are attitudes. So that's where my fun is at the moment.
Wonderful, wonderful. So it's going to be called A Therapist's Guide to Happiness.
I'm just starting to
You're just
put
starting.
the ideas on paper.
You get these books out like this,
I
so
do.
it won't take long. And The $1 Million Writer, I read it. It's fantastic. I wish I had read it before I started writing my own book, but you've also given me some tremendous tips on my own book. So
Your book is fantastic.
thank you. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge who you are as an individual. You know, in this day where we are so mercenary, where people are looking out for themselves, it's so refreshing to have you as a friend, somebody who always gives without any intention of giving or getting in return, and you're always giving, and yet the byproduct of all that generosity has been a blessed life, a blessed marriage,
Absolutely.
and a tremendous career and wealth in every capacity.
And that's the way I and others have always seen you, Debbie, as
Thank
well.
you.
And so that's, like people attract, and that's why I'm so glad you've got this television show now.
I love a good love fest. I hope you'll do a show. That may be the next thing. You're certainly great on the air, and I'm so glad that you were here with us today.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you. It's just been great. Love being around you. So if you enjoyed this, if you got good tips, please follow up with Rich Gallagher. Follow up with $1 Million Writer. Keep your eyes open for A Therapist's Guide to Happiness. And please tune back in with us again next month, because we're really delighted that we can help you with some of the work issues that you're facing. Thanks, and have a wonderful work day. Bye-bye.